and economic development, which is one of the core associations of the Universal Peace Federation. And one of our missions is to attract and develop innovative business, government, and economic thought leaders who can work together to impact society and lead to the creation of a global environment that's conducive to mutual prosperity between nations and between individuals within those nations as well. So today's topic is about banking, and particularly I think this is relevant given the recent collapse and rescue of several banks, including the Silicon Valley Bank, the First Republic Bank, and the Signature banks. So we want to look at what is the intended role of a bank and what role do the banks currently hold in today's society. So this discussion is also very closely tied to what money is. What does it represent? What's it used for? And what should it be in today's society? So there are various theories about money, such as modern monetary theory, and we want to look at a little bit at that and understand how those theories impact the role of banks, and especially central banks in society today. So our primary speaker today, Dr. Gordon Anderson, has written a book on integral society. Now, what is an integral society? It's a healthy society where all the social institutions are like the organs of the human body, and they work together to serve individuals and the common good. So in the human body, the heart doesn't perform the function of the brain or the liver. They all have their own place. And likewise, a government, a society, and the institutions within that society should function the same way. So we're going to look at the philosophical, ideological, and historical underpinnings of the institutions in society, especially the banks, to see what they should be doing and how they've strayed from their original role in serving society. So Gordon Anderson has a PhD in philosophy of religion with a minor in peace studies from Claremont Graduate University. And as the Secretary General of the Professors World Peace Academy, he organized comprehensive academic conferences on world social systems together with the late Professor Morton Kaplan at the University of Chicago. And Gordon has recently authored this book called Integral Society, Social Institutions and Individual Sovereignty. And he's also the president of Paragon House Publishers. So he has a lot of practical experience with finance and institutional governance through heading the finance committee of the Board of Trustees of the University of Bridgeport for many years, and as a member and president of the Legislative Evaluation Assembly of Minnesota, he wrote about the gradual erosion of constitutional processes and the hijacking of the state government by political parties and the administrative state. So Dr. Anderson, I'd like to invite you to share your presentation with us, and then we will have some interesting discussion at the end of this.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Alan Jessen for also helping to arrange this meeting. And I think I'll just go straight into the slide presentation, and we'll take it from there. Okay, is that working for everyone now?
Yes, that's good. Thank you.
Okay, so integral society, limiting the role of central banks and other social institutions. This is basically the introduction that Roger already read. So I think I will skip that and move right on to saying that the book is about integral society and the relationship of social institutions to individual sovereignty. And many social institutions, including governments, banks, universities, they were created to serve individuals and make their life easier, but inevitably they tend to exploit those that they tend to serve. And this book examines social institutions in three spheres: cultural, economic, and government. And the book also includes a new Declaration of Independence and a Constitution for an integral society, and a lot more about the development of human civilization from ancient times to the present. It's a big picture view, and banking is just 1.5 chapters in that book. But we can see, if we look through history, there have been rises and falls of civilizations. And in recent times, Roman Empire had actually a lot of individual sovereignty. So did Babylon. When the Roman Empire declined into feudalism, it was actually social institutions that became sovereign. And we wrested away from that, developed freedoms in the last 400 years, and gained a lot of individual sovereignty, created democracy, and now we're entering a period of neo-feudalism, and the bank and government cabals are definitely a part of that. And of course, we're looking forward to an integral society in which social institutions are limited to their purpose and individuals are sovereign. So let's start kind of in the middle of the historical development from feudalism after the Roman Empire, where the church and the crown were the sovereign institutions. In the cultural sphere, the church was sovereign, and it determined the values, official doctrine, and determined whether somebody was saved or not. In the political sphere, the king was the sovereign ruler, usually based on political conquest or inheritance, and he makes laws that people must obey. In the economic sphere, and this, the feudal lords and church fiefdoms really developed after a collapse of the Roman Empire, in which there are many parallels to what we see central banks doing today. There was a lot of dilution of the gold and silver content in money that enabled leaders to shift wealth from the middle classes to the elite. They controlled the land and the money, and in the feudal time, they owned their serfs' property, and monks and nuns took vows of celibacy and poverty. Now, as we move towards individual autonomy in three spheres, this is just real brief, but in the cultural sphere, the Protestant Reformation emphasizes individual salvation rather than salvation through a church. And individual cultural sovereignty develops on that foundation. The political sphere and self-governing individuals can create a government, and the king is elected as the administrator. There's political freedom, individual, that should be political sovereignty at the bottom. And in the economic sphere, at the US founding, most individuals and families owned houses, farms, and shops. We had a kind of economic democracy at the founding of the United States because economic production was 95% labor and 5% capital. Almost everybody owned a farm or had a business or had a trade. And most all Americans were self-sufficient, and I would require that individual economic autonomy was also necessary for democracy to exist. Of course, we had the problem of the slaves, but in general, people were economically sovereign. Now we're seeing, in the present time, new social institutions are displacing individual autonomy in all three social spheres. Mass media, universities, and others are seeking official knowledge, and they're opposing the thought of independent media, people who think outside the box are persecuted and censored. In the political sphere, political parties and the administrative states now determine the law. Individuals are shut out of the governance process as Republican forms of governance are circumvented. And in the economic sphere, government central bank cabals control the wealth by printing, I put in quotes, counterfeit money, because it's legal money, but it's really kind of a fake money. It's official, but it's based on non-productive activity. And this transfers wealth from the middle classes to new economic lords in a parallel kind of how feudalism developed after the Roman Empire. So all three spheres, when they're directly controlled, it's like it's communist totalitarianism, while fascism and neo-feudalism represent cabals between social institutions. In other words, social institutions aren't acting according to their role. In an integral society, social institutions should be limited to their role and their purpose, which is to serve individual autonomy. In the cultural sphere, media platforms should provide access to everyone. Opposing thought and independent studies should be welcome. Social institutions should be forbidden from influencing laws. In the political sphere, representative government should be restored. Political parties should remain free associations, but they should play no role in the governance process. Right now, we have the establishment of party that's very parallel to what the establishment of religion was in feudal time. Governments are forbidden from borrowing from central banks. That would be, again, separation of political and economic functions. In the economic sphere, central banks should be limited to serving as check clearing houses and controlling the money supply. A central bank should not lend money or purchase securities. Central bank should be a referee, not a player. Right now we have a situation like the referees of the Super Bowl game were all on one side. Individual sovereignty should be restored in all three spheres. The primary economic problem is wealth transfer through printing fake money. And so here I put fake money as that printed for a non-productive purpose. In other words, through loans not backed by real assets, goods, or services. Governments and financial industries have access to fake money printed by central banks that is not based on real assets or economic goods or services. Government today can, through fractional reserve banking, and now no reserve is required, they can get as much money as they want from the central bank, and that's really a corrupt system. Political parties are vehicles for controlling legislation, so this fake money can be handed out to social institutions. And basically the people that lobby the political parties are those that determine the government policies. As I said before, people are shut out of the process. The recipients of new money control lawmaking, media, judges, and others. So it's not the producing people that are making the laws. It's the recipients of this fake money that are ultimately making the laws. Citizens' money is devalued in the process as the money supply expansion goes for non-productive elites. So limiting the role of a central bank is a main function of fixing this process. To create an integral society, social institutions need to be limited to performing their purpose like organs of a human body, and so should the central bank. The government central bank cabals lie at the base of economic injustice, shifts in wealth, and motivations to use political parties to circumvent a Republican form of democracy. Therefore, the primary focus of social change, at least one of the most important focuses, should begin with limiting the role of a central bank to end these cabals. So what is the primary purpose of a central bank? It should be to provide currency for the economy. This includes the initial money that's printed and goes into the economy, which is called the base currency, then maintaining a money supply for fractional reserve lending, and then replacing damaged currency. It also should serve as a financial clearinghouse that enables a relationship of banks between each other. So if a check on one bank wants to be cashed by another bank, there's a way to clear that nationally. Also exchanging foreign currencies and providing necessary currency to banks to make sure that there's plenty, the right amount in the money supply. As a government institution, or at least a quasi-government institution, a central bank should be an economic referee and not a player. It should not print money except for maintaining the money supply. If it does anything else, it becomes a player. It should not lend money or charge interest. It's an economic player, and when it does that, it becomes a bank itself, not a referee for banks. It should not buy securities or assets. One of the ways the Fed controls things is by buying securities and selling securities, and this should not be their role. The government should not be able to borrow any money from a central bank, in my view, and the central bank should not hold reserves. It should not be an economic player. Hayek on money. I just wanted to read this quote. The great trouble is that money wasn't allowed to develop. After 200 or 300 years of the use of coins, government stopped any further development. We were not allowed to experiment on it. So money hasn't been improved. It's rather become worse in the course of time. Money was frozen in its most primitive form. What we have had since was mostly government abuses of money. And I believe that's the case. We've had mostly government abuses of money, but we have had some developments. I think printed money and fractional reserve banking are improvements on coins or trading of gold. We talked about defining money a little bit. I'd like to go over 3 features of money. One, it's a unit of account. An example of this comes from the florin in Amsterdam. The Bank of Amsterdam, there were so many merchants in Amsterdam and so much international trade bringing so many different kinds of coins in. The businessmen didn't know how to deal with that. And the Bank of Amsterdam created a accounting unit, this kind of a fictional unit of value, which was a standardized unit by which they valued all the coins. And it was kind of an example of a first central bank in that it performed some national function. Traditionally, money is a medium of exchange, coins, printed notes. And I think it's important that money be anonymous in its exchange, and it has to have a trusted value. And historically, money was a store of value. It had intrinsic value as a commodity like gold and precious metals. There's a problem with that. Not that we shouldn't value gold, but there's a problem when you make that the standard of money. Printed money. Since the initial development of money as an accounting unit by the Bank of Amsterdam, printed money as notes that represent economic goods and services has proven useful and efficient when it is trusted. This trust is based on reliance and stability. In fact, the florin served as the European reserve currency for about 200 years. It was relied on much the way the dollar became the world reserve currency after World War II. Counterfeiting must be prevented, or that dilutes the money supply. And the money supply should represent real articles of value, goods, services, new houses, new buildings, etc. Printed money can expand with economic growth. A gold standard causes inflation and deflation because it is not mined at the same rate a natural economy grows. Some gold miner doesn't find new gold at the exact same rate. A new generation of people want to build houses, for example. And when we saw the bank rush, the gold rush in California, we immediately saw inflation causing, because there was much more gold on the market than there had been the previous decade. But then it trailed off, and then we had deflations. Fractional reserve banking. This is a system first developed by the Swedish Right Bank in 1668, and within 30 years, the system was hijacked by the government. Banks lend out money that does not exist using accounting ledgers. So again, money is a unit of accounting in this system, while keeping only 10% in reserve. A central bank increases the money supply to ensure currency is available to lending banks to cover the loans. This new money creation provides easy access to loans for anyone to build a house or fund a business. And when the loans are made in fractional reserve banking, they are wiped off the ledger and money is effectively destroyed. Dangers of fractional reserve banking. Banks can collapse with bank runs because you don't have enough in the vault to cover all the deposits that the depositors have. And this problem was largely fixed with requiring a certain reserve, either 10, 15, 20%, as well as insurance. So we have the FDIC. And that tended to work. Banks use money for speculation instead of economic production. This problem was partly solved by the Glass-Steagall Act, or the Banking Act of 1933, which prevented banks using deposits for other purposes than banking. In other words, separated from the insurance industry, separating from investments and brokerages. And this was unfixed when the law was repealed in 1999. And that's one of the causes of why we're in such chaos today. Central banks print fake money on their own reserves to lend to governments and financial industries with interest. This is a problem that has not been fixed. And this is the problem that, in my view, is the core problem to why we are heading towards a neo-feudalism. Why don't more people see the problem with the current system? Well, for one thing, new money is created so people don't actually lose money they have in the bank, and they get a little interest. So they don't know there's stuff going on. They don't see anything happening to their personal money. The current system has led to faster economic growth than a gold-backed system or 100% reserve lending. So people have seen great economic development while we have been in the last 400 years with these practices. And the system has been around so long, most bankers, people that learn banking, just accept the system as it is. Marxists saw the injustice, but they blame it on corporate greed. They fail to explain the faulty mechanism, which is a central bank that is a player rather than a referee. And on the other side, conservative economists tend to think that the problem is printing money or fractional reserve banking, not their corruption when a central bank becomes a player rather than a referee. So here you have the left wing and the right wing, and what I'm proposing is something that is more head wing. History of the Cabal. In 1694, the Bank of England was created to hold all government deposits, as well as the power to issue new notes to pay for the government debt. The Bank of England enabled King William to get money for wars without going to the people. But the new money did not go for productive purposes, and the bank was broke in 1696. The government declared the bank's notes the only legal tender and prosecuted all counterfeiting, keeping a monopoly on the money. The bank charged the government interest and enriched itself at taxpayer expense. And so they both agreed to cheat because it was both in both of their advantage, and that's the basis of a cabal. The people experienced structural oppression through taxation and currency devaluation. Other countries in Europe followed this pattern, making the Rothschild family, they were in 5 European banks, and other banksters, in other words, banking gangsters, exceedingly rich. The US fought over the British bank model at its founding. Alexander Hamilton wanted the British model. Jefferson opposed it. Hamilton initially won, and Andrew Jackson got rid of the central bank, but the 19th century banks on the gold standard saw many depressions and runs on banks. And in 1913, the Federal Reserve System was created as a cabal, ostensibly to solve the problems of 19th century banking, but it was created on the British model, immediately enabled the funding of World War I. In fact, J.P. Morgan pushed this and other endless wars and money laundering. We've seen that going on ever since. And we had to change the Constitution to make it legal to do this. The 16th Amendment was required to fund the system because it required backing through the citizens through taxation. Before the 16th Amendment, the Constitution had said that the federal government, if it was to get any taxes, it was to put a tax on the states on an apportioned basis. Recently, the US has been merging the big banks with the central bank and making the reserve requirement zero. That was in March or May 2021. They just lowered the reserve to zero. It's just a real, not even anything to back it anymore. In preparation for central bank digital currency, which is a complete economic dominion over individuals. The solution, limiting the central bank's role. And I don't know if you can do this in the US. Maybe a country like El Salvador would have a chance to do this while they're going through changes, and then some other country could see the success. But fractional reserve banking should continue, I argue, through state and local banks with strict reserve limits and insurance by the FDIC or some other form of insurance. Central banks should only be a referee, clearing checks and managing the money supply. Central banks should be forbidden from lending, purchasing securities, charging interest on new money. Like other agencies, they should only receive a service fee to cover the cost of labor and printing currency. Bank deposits should remain depositors' money. I don't know if people know this, but now when you put the money in the bank, your deposit becomes the bank's money. And on their accounting ledgers, they create an IOU that you can withdraw. But if the banks treated that as your money and not their own, we would see some different behavior as well. Bank loans should remain with the originating bank and not resold on secondary markets. One problem we have here, and this isn't with the central bank, but with local banks, you'll find now there are incentives for them to go out and and get a loan and sign it up, regardless of whether it's secure or risky, because they're going to take the originating fee and resell it to American Express or some other big bank, and they're going to take their money and leave the big bank with some worthless property. And so I think one of the requirements is that banks who create the loan ought to keep it. And anyway, they should not treat it as their own loan, but a loan from their depositors. And the banks are only getting a service fee on that money, and the depositors actually hold the loan. So those are some of the points I'm making. This discussion focused on economic feudalism. We actually have, like I said, feudalism coming again in all three social spheres. And there's a constant threat that leaders of all social institutions will abuse their power, misuse institutional funds, use the institutions they manage for ulterior or ideological purposes, and seek government support for these institutions through corrupt political processes. So a lot of the institutions don't even care if they're funded by the people they're supposed to originally created to serve. They're seeking other money. My book also has a new Declaration of Independence and sets up updates to the US Constitution. So that's the end of my slide presentation, and I'm happy to move into response or questions based on what you want, Roger.
Well, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a very interesting and perhaps a little bit radical what you're proposing. I have one quick question before I move on to our respondent, Sunhyun Miller. You talk about fake money and real money. And, you know, in today's society, money is not really printed so much anymore. It's generated with a few keystrokes, right? Somebody goes onto a computer somewhere and says, make another $100 million. And that's how it gets into the economy. So what in your mind is the difference between fake and real, and how much money, how much new money should be created?
New money should be created based on economic production. So traditionally, your local bank, they won't give you a loan unless you've got some kind of collateral. So if you're building a house, they'll put a lien on the house. If you're buying a car, they'll put a lien on the car. There'll be some asset to back up the loan they're creating, and so that, and also businesses that take out corporate loans, they will have to either put their property up or something else to guarantee the loan. So that's asset-backed new money. It's made by fractional reserve money. You can have $100,000 on deposit in the bank and lend out $1 million as an accounting procedure. And that's originally electronic, or just, you know, but it's not fake because it's based on new assets that are being introduced into the economy, and the economy is expanding. Fake money is when a loan is given for a non-productive purpose. For example, a government getting a loan for a war, or to create a new agency for climate change, or some other activity that doesn't really create any economic assets. So some people call that counterfeit money or fake money. It's not, it's legal because what the government considers counterfeit is anything that's not their dollar bill. But what is counterfeit from an economic standpoint is that which is not based on economic goods and services. And so currency backed by real goods and services is fine, and it's good money. Does that explain?
Yes, I think so. but I'm sure there'll be some debate about this or some comments when we get to the discussion. I'd like to move on now to our next presenter, or our respondent rather, Sun-Hyun Miller, who perhaps represents a younger generation here. And Sun-Hyun has a BA in computer science. He's a software engineer and the founder and president of his own software consulting company, Software Consulting. So he received his bachelor's degree in computer science from Thomas Edison State University, and currently works as a full-time software engineer. And while his formal training is in computer science and engineering, he has also pursued a personal passion for economics, politics, philosophy, and religion. So during the early years of his career, he worked as a software engineer in the back office of a major national bank. And while he was there, he developed a great interest in the economics of money and banking, and explored the ways that money comes into existence and how it moves around through the system. So I'm very happy to have him offering perhaps the insider perspective from the banking side of things. Sun-Hyun, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gordon, for that very thought-provoking presentation. Before I respond, I thought I would take a moment to talk a little bit about my philosophy of money. So I feel like money at its heart is the power to impel human action. I use the word impel, which means to, it's not compel, it's not compulsion, you're not forcing somebody. When you offer somebody money, you're giving them an incentive to do something, but they have the right to refuse. But it's still a very powerful thing. So the people who have the money can spend that to impel human action and direct what human beings use their time and their energy and their resources for. So when a government inflates the money supply, or they print new money and they get to use that money, then the money that they use, there's only so much productivity that all the human beings in the country can do. The money they use will divert human activity away from other things and towards the things that the new money is being spent on. So the interesting thing about inflation is, if you were to do inflation completely neutrally, where everybody, the amount of money they have is increased by the same percentage, and everybody's wages went up by the same percentage, and the price of all goods went up by the same percentage, it would have zero net effect. There would be no problem with it. It's just a number after all. And the only thing that's important is the relative amounts of the numbers. That we know that, for instance, a banana is more expensive than an apple, so maybe I'll buy an apple because it's cheaper. The problem with the way that the government introduces money into the money supply is that it's unequal. So the people who get the money first have the privilege of spending it first when it's most powerful, when it's most potent. As money circulates around the economy and it starts going after goods, you see inflation, the prices tend to go up, but there's a time delay. So when the money is first injected into the economy is when it's the most potent. It's at the same value as money currently in existence. And when we look at our country, money that is printed tends to go towards governments and banks. And it tends to be spent on the things that governments and banks want to spend it on. Now, in our country, it's technically illegal for the central bank to print money and give it directly to the government to fund its activities. But we basically do that with just one step removed. So the central bank buys US treasuries, which is government debt, on the secondary market. And often it will announce in advance, like, oh, we're going to buy so much debt at such a time. And so then banks will buy debt from the government and then sell it directly to the central bank. And so basically you have the central bank is effectively funding the government's debt with only one step removed in order to get around that issue of, directly funding the bank. And so over the past 20 years, the government has been funding many wars through debt. And we see that the United States is the #1 weapons manufacturer in the whole world. Many people, cry out over the death of American manufacturing, but actually American manufacturing is alive and well. We produce some of the most advanced and amazing things in this country. One problem is a lot of our manufacturing is taken away towards things that could be productive and things that are inherently destructive and could not be productive ever, which are weapons. So America produces the most weapons by far of any country in the world, and we sell them around the world to our friends and allies, or sometimes people who are our enemies, but they happen to be the enemies of our enemies, so we consider them a friend for the moment. But the question is, those weapons that get produced, they don't actually enrich us as a country. So what would happen if the government had not borrowed that money, and those productive human hours and money and capital could have been done towards something that's more productive? Our country would have been, we would all be more wealthy for it. And so it's sort of, it comes back to the fallacy of the broken window, where it can seem like money that's printed out of thin air, well, it's just free money. What's the problem with spending it? You're not stealing it away from anyone. But you have to understand that this diverts money away from productive ends and towards other ends, ends that are less productive. And the government, I believe, is never going to be as efficient at directing money as individuals are, because individuals know their own situation best, and they're going to be the most careful with their own money spent for their own purposes. So that's basically my theory about money and why inflation tends to be a bad thing, or at least a very unproductive thing. Now, Dr. Anderson proposed in his solution that fractional reserve banking should continue through state and local banks with strict reserve limits and insurance by the FDIC. He also suggested that central banks should only be a referee, clearing checks and managing the money supply, and that central banks should be forbidden from lending, purchasing securities, or charging interest on new money. Now, I think those would all be steps in the right direction, but I also think that we could achieve something similar by maybe getting rid of the Federal Reserve altogether, or at least minimizing its role in the economy very much, and allowing private institutions to take up the role of clearinghouses and other such things. As evidence of that, I would like to refer to Rose Schwartz and Milton Friedman, who wrote A Monetary History of the United States. And they looked into the causes of the Great Depression, or when they first wrote the book, they weren't intending to challenge the reigning understanding of the Great Depression, but it just so happened in their study of monetary history, it appeared to them that the causes of the Great Depression, as they were traditionally understood, which is just speculation in the stock market, a bubble bursting, and then people feeling depressed about the economy, so they keep all their money in reserve, and it drives down aggregate demand. That didn't really explain the whole thing. And instead, it was actually the failure of banks and the extreme contraction of the money supply that caused a huge depression. And so between 1929 and 1933, in 1929, for every $3 that were in existence, in 1933, only $2 were in existence. And by dollars, I'm referring not just to physical currency, I'm referring to deposits. That banks, money that's created by banks through fractional reserve banking. Yeah, there was a huge decrease in the money supply caused by the failure of almost half of all the banks in the country. It went from about 25,000 down to about 12,000. And the Federal Reserve, which had been put in place in 1913, just a decade prior, had been designed specifically for the purpose of preventing such bank failures. But it stood idly by and allowed these banks to fail and did not step in. And the banks failed due to bank runs, where people were withdrawing money, more money than the bank had on reserve. Now, A few years prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1907, there was the Panic of 1907, which did cause some damage to the economy, but it was very short-lived, not like the Great Depression, which lasted a decade. And one of the reasons it was short-lived is because banks were allowed to more free to regulate and protect themselves in a free market. And so they instituted a policy called a restriction of payments, where they said, in order to prevent bank runs from destroying banks, they said, we will continue to operate as normal. You can still send checks, wires, whatever. What you can't do is withdraw your money as cash. And that's what it means by payment, a restriction of being paid out of your deposit in cash. And so while there was this panic, they had a restriction of payments in place, which was a very drastic measure. But when the panic subsided, they let it go, and the banking crisis was over. In 1913, when they created the Federal Reserve, they thought, we've solved banking forever. We don't need, banks can give can honor their deposits 100%. So they actually made it illegal to put in place a restriction of payments. And so the government took away the free market solution to bank runs and created a public solution, which then it failed to do properly, and it caused the greatest depression in history. So I would ask, my question for Dr. Anderson would be, what do you think about having returning to a free banking system, something that we'd have prior to the Federal Reserve? And do you think that could be a good solution instead of what you proposed?
Well, thank you very much, Sun Hyun. And I think I'm going to ask if we can bring Gordon back onto the screen here. And if Gordon, if you'd like to respond to that last question there.
Yeah, thank you, Sun Hyun. Before I respond, I just want to thank you for making the 2 points initially in your philosophy about how new money diverts activity. And I was mentioning it diverts wealth, but it also diverts activity and the types of things produced. That was an important point to make. Now, as far as what you're proposing with free bank, I personally believe that human nature lifts its ugly head everywhere. In the free market, if you let everything totally go unregulated, you get something like Standard Oil, where you have a monopoly that controls everything, because you can't expect a social institution to self-regulate. I mean, it's great when they do. And if you have a moral society, it's more likely that they will, which is one of the reasons our founders said that our system of government could only stand with a moral people. But what you're saying with restriction of payments is exactly what happened in England when the Cabal started. In 1694, the Bank of England became the official bank to take care of all the government money. And then by 1696, it was broke, and there was a run on the bank. So they declared a suspension of specie. In other words, they could not redeem the notes in gold or silver at that time. And eventually that was loosened up, and they could again be changed. But the Cabal was in place. And I personally think that you need an independent institution that the government cannot access money from. And so it could be that some of the things you mentioned, like having independent clearinghouses or private clearinghouses, maybe there could be private clearinghouses that could perform that function, but somebody has to print the money. And if you don't have a central bank, then it would be the U.S. Treasury. I'd hate to see the U.S. Treasury printing the money. I think it would be a huge conflict of interest. I'd rather see an independent agency. So yes, we could take the a central bank down to an even smaller function than what I was recommending. But whatever it does, it should be a referee and not a player.
Can I just ask a little bit on how do they act as a referee if they don't have this power to like set interest rates or to charge interest on this money that they're?
There would be no need to adjust interest rates if they had no control over buying and selling securities, and the government had to get its loans from other banks or sell directly to people. So the government could sell U.S. savings bonds to citizens for a war effort. And then the citizens would really have to back the war effort, not some cabal that's against the citizens. So if you have governments, another bank would not lend to the government unless there were assets to back it. So they might back a loan to a government for a highway. It could be paid and would be an economic asset to the economy, but they wouldn't be able to. No bank would fund a loan for government to create a new agency to monitor climate or something.
So I think I get the idea. So it would be much more of individual responsibilities deciding how the government actually is going to get its money to spend.
Yeah, either they'd have to go directly to the people in a representative form of democracy, because you wouldn't have all this funny money that all these social institutions were going to the government for through their political parties. But right now you have social institutions on the left using the Democrat Party. You have social institutions on the right using the Republican Party. There's a treasury there that's got all this printed money they go after. And it has nothing to do with neither party has an interest in really serving the people. That's one reason Trump is such an anathema to the system.
So I have a question here from Wayne. He's saying, Gordon, you mentioned that CDBC, where all money becomes digital, controlled by the prevailing party in power. When do you think that will happen?
Well, central bank digital currency is already happening. But just even this last week, or even the last couple of days, we've heard the World Health Organization wanting to tie World Health permits to World Health records to individual bank accounts all over the world. And so if you didn't do something, they would, like in the health area, they could suspend your bank account, or you didn't do something the government would like, they could suspend your bank account. This is not separating the social institutions, but creating a different kind of cabal. And then, of course, you have Bitcoin, which is digital currency that's more anonymous, that the government can control. They hate that, and that's what we talk about. Mentioned earlier, the collapse of this bank in California, and also the one that Barney Frank in New York had some interest in. Both of those banks were dealing in cryptocurrencies, and so they were taken down as much as they failed. I don't think they had to fail. But what you had was a move by centralizers to get rid of banks that were accepting other forms of currency.
Well, they didn't really fail in the end. They were just sold off at a very cheap rate to somebody else, right? But you mentioned cryptocurrency, and I know we were going to get into that. I wanted to ask Sun Hyun if you had some thoughts on this whole move to digital currency as well. So, and how that's going to go.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think that I believe in the maxim that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I think that's a big problem with centralization, is you concentrate power into the hands of a few. And you might get lucky and people use it wisely, but then in the next generation, you might get unlucky and people don't use it wisely. And when you have power centralized to such an extent and it's used unwisely, the damage can be catastrophic. If you have a bad actor who just controls a small local bank, the damage will be contained. But if you have a bad actor who controls a huge central bank that has a central bank digital currency where you can track everybody's, exactly what people have spent their money on and who they've sent it to and when, down to the millisecond. I think it's very, very dangerous to put that much power into the hands of a few people. So I would definitely fight against it. It could be used for very, very bad purposes. And in the realm of cryptocurrency in general, I think that it's good for the government to compete. I don't like it when the government creates monopolies for itself. If the government believes that, well, nobody could create a perfect money unless they had the government, well, then prove it by, you create your money and let other people create theirs and see which one people want to use. Now, the government, of course, has an advantage in that they can require that your taxes be paid in their currency. But still, I would very much like to see competition against the government. For instance, in the USPS, people like it a lot, but they still send packages through FedEx and UPS. So if you give people more choices, I think you can see more experimentation and maybe new and better forms of money come out that we haven't seen before.
I'm not too sure on the whole cryptocurrency thing. I think it's a bit of a fad and it's going to disappear.
Already in India, they are doing it, cryptocurrencies. They're already.
Yeah, I would request that you please don't speak out. If you want to ask a question, please post it in the chat. Thank you.
I had one question for Dr. Anderson.
Yeah, go ahead.
In your system, currently the Federal Reserve introduces new money into the economy by buying securities and debt.
Yes.
You said you wouldn't want them to do that. So how would they introduce money into the economy in your scheme?
In my scheme, they would print money and they would introduce it by providing it to banks that needed it because of their fractional reserve lending if currency needed to come in, and they would charge a fee for servicing the bank with currency, and the amount of currency they would allow, they would also manage the money supply. This is another thing Milton Friedman said should be the only role of a central bank, is to manage the money supply. You could control inflation and make it zero if you manage the money supply wisely, because right now they build in this 2% per year to cover corruption. And sometimes when they get too corrupt, we see inflation that 2% can't cover. So we've seen 0% interest. We've seen 17% interest in the time of Jimmy Carter. But basically should be zero inflation if it's done right.
Let's see. From what I've heard, they want to try and maintain a 2% inflation. That's kind of the goal. Why do you say 0%?
I said the 2% covers the corruption that they have. When their corruption has been modest, and they want to control inflation to 2%, which means they have to tame government corruption a bit. But now we've got so many trillions of government debt that it's really got to the point of unsustainability.
So we're kind of at our time here, but I just wanted to get a couple more questions in here. So I have one from Thomas Sellover here, who says, for you, Gordon, in your initial slides, you highlighted autonomy or individual sovereignty in cultural, political, and economic spheres. My question is, how do you see individual sovereignty in relation to God's sovereignty? How can your discussion of individual sovereignty help to explain what might be meant practically by God's sovereignty?
Yes, I did not bring up God's sovereignty, but I encourage you to read the value statement of this Alan Jessen's organization, Citizens for Economic and Social Justice, because there they list God's sovereignty, individual sovereignty, and institutional sovereignty in a very good way. In other words, God's sovereignty is first in the lives of individuals, but then individuals are sovereign in the institutions of the world.
Good. And Alan actually has a comment in the chat here as well. He said the Federal Reserve Act originally intended for money entering the economy through the discount window to support private production. Now they use open market operations to buy securities to fund government. So can legislation reverse that process? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I don't know whether it would be possible right now, given the people who make the legislation. They won't correct themselves. It's like acting a gang to change its behavior and stop robbing people. I mean, the whole process is corrupt, and I see this a money creation system as the basis of the whole corrupt system, or basically the way it can be sustained. So, you know, I say you should have a central bank that's a separate agency and got a very limited mission. And you might have to start it in El Salvador, Ukraine, or the Czech Republic, or somewhere where there's going to be an interest in changing, or you're going to have to wait for the entire system to collapse here, which it almost had when they did the Glass-Steagall Act, the Bank Act of 1933. We basically had a system that was so desperate that they had to do something right.
Okay. Getting back to the CDBC again, I have one more from an anonymous person here. Isn't the CDBC in opposition to the very concept of the decentralized concept of digital currency and people's freedom to use the money as they see fit without the government sniffing in every aspect of people's life? So yes, privacy, I think, is a big concern about this. Once everything's digital, the government can see everything that we're spending money on, right? And I think that's one of the prime reasons why many governments are pushing for it. What are your thoughts?
Governments will push for it because this is a way to do the traditional cabal on steroids, and to do it at an international level and really have a few international people controlling the whole world. But there's a lot of experimental digital currencies out there. Some of them are centralized, some of them are decentralized. I think when a lot of them, they're talking about stable coin, but stable coin has to be pegged to something. And then, so that's usually a different centralized currency or something else. Whereas Bitcoin, that one is totally independent, but you can't adjust swings in the value of a Bitcoin because it's a limited supply and you have different levels of economic growth.
Yeah, I think in many countries, though, they've got almost cashless societies these days, especially in like Europe. I was in Australia recently, and you know, I was there for 2 weeks. I didn't have to pull out a dollar bill at all. So, so Sun-Hyun, what's your feelings about this, about moving to a totally digital society?
Well, I think it all depends on who's in control and who's in charge of it. If
it's so convenient, though.
Yeah, I mean, if individuals are in charge of their own, accounts and their own money, and there's a good degree of privacy and security, then I think a cashless society is totally fine. It's very, very, very convenient to not have to worry about change. But I think if the government is spying on these digital accounts, then I think that that's very dangerous, and I would definitely not support that.
Okay. Another area that some people have brought up in the chat here is about how this works in countries that are not necessarily democratic. So, for example, China or some of these other countries where they use or they manipulate their currencies in very different ways, right? So what are your thoughts on how banks are functioning in places like China and Russia and other countries? Have you looked into that at all?
Well, they function very differently, but they use a central bank. Then in China, the government controls it more. So I don't think I'm not sure, maybe Sun Hyun knows, but I don't think they introduce new money through debt. But I think the party controls a lot of expenditures that are not based on any real assets. And so other countries won't accept their currency as convertible. In China and Nigeria, they've tried to institute central bank digital currency, and along with it, print a certain amount in notes that can be used as currency that's tied to that central bank digital currency. But they've been in havoc for 2 years because a lot of people are just, they might not even have a smartphone or might not have the means to deal just with digital currency. A lot of people have a habit of exchanging things with printed money. And you really have to change the culture also. It's caused great problems in Nigeria.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to kind of wrap up today. And I know there's a lot of people who have additional questions and comments. So I think we could close today and thank everybody for participating. We hold these meetings every Tuesday, and we're going to invite the live audience, if you'd like to stay on for a few more minutes. If you want to ask any questions, you can certainly post them to Dr. Anderson or Sun Hyun Miller, and we can enjoy some further conversation. So if you would like to sign up for future programs, you can do so on our website at us.upf.org. Thank you.
Roger, there was one question from James Edgerly that I thought was interesting.